called the monopiscopate, which happened quite early in church history, but not in 97 AD.
Monopiscopate meaning there is one bishop.
One bishop over an entire city.
Okay.
It has authority over any local churches or elders.
Yes.
Clement didn't know about that. All he knew about was a local church and elders.
Yes.
And I believe that is indeed the biblical pattern. But soon they had the monopiscopate, bishops over cities, and then as church history went on, after Constantine, the church became more powerful, and Rome became more powerful, and then developed the idea that the bishop in Rome had more status than bishops in other cities. So we get further and further away from the New Testament ideal of elders being the authority in the local church. And then you have one bishop, but they're scattered around all the cities. Each city has its own. And then you have the bishop of Rome having more prominence than all the other bishops. And then eventually he's called the Pope, and then he's endued with all kinds of authority and power. And now you have apostles again.
Is this an example of the church trying to be more like the world?
Well, I think it's certainly an example of sinful nature. The idea of having kings and some special high status person that has authority over others is a departure from the authority of Scripture and the priesthood of every believer. This hierarchy where there's some guy at the top who speaks for God, and then we have to listen to him. This all developed within the auspices of what became Roman Catholicism. But I have strong evidence that it wasn't understood that way, even at the very end of the apostolic era.
Just as a quick recap, what were the earmarks of an apostle?
They had to have seen the resurrected Christ. And Paul says that he's the last in a series. If you look at the Greek in 1 Corinthians 15, and finally, as one born out of time, me. So Paul was the last one to actually see the resurrected Christ, and he did so in a special occurrence where Christ came and appeared to him bodily. And therefore, after John, probably the last living apostle, died, there are no more apostles. And there wasn't intended to be. In fact, it's interesting that we have in the New Testament qualifications for elders and instructions about how to appoint them.
Yes.
Okay? Where are the qualifications for future apostles?
Not existent.
They're non-existent. And ironically, because of that, today these people claiming to be apostles, many of them aren't even qualified to be an elder.
Wow.
Because in the absence of any qualifications, anybody that claims to be an apostle can just put on their apostle badge or whatever they have and go out and try to find followers.
We've done a few programs on some of those aspects. Okay, the Roman Catholic apostles. From 97 on, what's the progression?
Well, as I said, you had the monopiscopate, bishops over cities, and then the primacy of Rome, which was more of a political thing than anything spiritual. And then the idea that the bishop of Rome is a successor and an apostle. And then you have the whole idea of Peter had been at Rome, and then all of the succeeding bishops of Rome are sitting in the seat of Peter as the apostle over the church. Okay? And so now you have ongoing authorities that have apostolic authority, and they claim the right to speak for God in a binding way. So when the Pope sits in his seat, in the seat of Peter, and declares something to be binding from God beyond the Scripture, he claims that all Christians everywhere must obey him under threat of sinning against God.
Wow. You know, I read this quote that you'd introduced from the Catholic Encyclopedia, and I've got to read part of this thing.
No, Dick, I think this will bring back memories from your childhood, won't it?
It does. It does. And I could quote this. Even as a kid, you know, we were well trained and knew my catechism pretty well. So anyway, the quote was this. This is the Catholic Church talking. We teach and define that it is a dogma divinely revealed that the Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, the thing you were talking about, Bob, that is when in discharge of the office of pastor and doctor of all Christians by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. We just talked about the fact that this doesn't exist, but they're now quoting it as a fact.
Yeah, one of their own quote-unquote popes, Clement, didn't believe this at all.
And he's one of the linchpins to Peter.
And he points to the real apostles, not to himself.
Yes.
So they have to know that this document exists. So what kind of a doctoring of history does the Catholic Church do to come up with this doctrine?
Well, I don't need to read the rest of that because I wanted to get to that point, but by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, I stopped when I read that, underlined it, and said, oh my.
Well, then at the end they say that by the definitions of the Roman pontiff are of themselves and not from the consent of the church, irreformable. So we can't reform anything the Pope says.
Once it's been ex cathedra, that's it.
Yeah, that's it. It's no more reformable than the book of Romans.
Wow. Well,
even if it's in contradiction to what the Scripture does say.
That's scary. Well, back to C. Peter Wagner. We kind of got a field on that, but it's necessary to follow how that got built into what we would call early Christianity.
Okay, here's the
in
irony.
Some form.
Okay, so here we have in 1996, Peter Wagner launches a new movement calling it an Apostolic Reformation, saying that we need new apostles in the church. The ones in the Bible weren't sufficient. And he actually cites the Roman Catholic Church as being an example of churches that have apostles, as if that helps justify the whole thing. What kind of Protestantism is this? Here's what he says, C. Peter Wagner. In certain segments of the church, the office of apostle has indeed been recognized throughout the past 2 millennia. The Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican or Episcopal Church, and many denominations that have actually incorporated apostolic into their name. So he's using this for justification of him doing it.
Wow.
Now, what happened to the Reformation? And you know what's even more ironic? As I was studying this, we did a conference on it back in like 2002, and I did a bunch of research back then. These guys that have this restoration scenario claim the Reformation as part of the restoration. Okay? So they look back to the Reformation as a good thing, and then they come out here and deny the main points of the Reformation.
I was just going to say, how many of the original people, Luther, etc., of that group would be agreeing with what they're doing?
Well, none of them.
They wouldn't, right?
No, absolutely not. So this is not a new Reformation that's coming out of Colorado Springs now, where Wagner has moved. It's a new repudiation of the Reformation.
Well, my question to you after this was just simply, how does the new Apostolic Reformation differ from the Roman Catholic Church?
There's one key difference. The Roman Catholic Church only has one apostle. And
see where this is going.
He only speaks ex cathedra
once in a while.
Now and again.
Yes.
It doesn't happen often. The New Apostolic Reformation, by their own count, has thousands of apostles.
Yes.
All over the world. And they're speaking for God willy-nilly anytime they see fit. And maybe they can't get a big enough audience, but they'll bind anybody they can get under their spell to their words from God. So I'd say the Pope is probably safer than these apostles.
Wow. That's scary. Okay, well, you've already touched on it, but I would like you to tie this back to the Reformation. I'll read your comment in your paper because I thought it was really good. The Reformation rightly rejected the authority of the Pope and church tradition and returned to Scripture alone. That was Luther. This was a return to the true foundation of the church, the biblical apostles and prophets who speak to us through the Scripture. This means that the decrees of men in church history are not binding on any believer unless those decrees are valid implications and applications of Scripture. You would stand with that now. That's what you teach.
Absolutely. As we've said in other broadcasts, God never binds his church to error.
Yes.
He never commands us to do what's in error. If we don't do what's in error, we're sinning against God. No, he only binds us to what's inerrant and infallible.
Yes.
And I'm telling you, the Pope's not infallible. I'm saying that these latter-day apostles are teaching even more error, and that they don't speak for God, and that we don't have to obey them. We only have to obey what's a valid implication from Scripture. Now, this seems so simple.
It does.
But Wagner claims that his movement is the biggest one in the entire church right now, and that the apostolic movement is the fastest growing segment of Christianity. Maybe he's right. If he is, we're in big trouble. Now, you and I know people in the movement.
Oh, yes.
I've talked to people. I'm not doing this